Have you ever thought about why certain behaviors are repeated, even though we know they can be harmful? There's something intriguing about these vicious cycles that bind us, like an invisible force. They start out discreet, almost harmless, but over time they become something more, something unavoidable. What makes us persist on this path, even when the end always seems to be the same? Why do we pursue something that we know is destructive? Is it a character flaw, or is there something deeper behind it? What really drives the incessant search for relief, even though we know it can cause us pain? The answer may lie in an inner emptiness, an attempt to fill an invisible gap that prevents us from finding peace. Our aim here is to better understand addiction, not just as a behavioral problem, but as a symptom of something deeper. Addiction, in Carl Jung's view, is not a mere character flaw or moral weakness, but rather an expression of a psyche out of balance. For Jung, addictions have a more complex origin. They are forms of escape, unconscious strategies for dealing with psychological suffering, or an existential void that seems impossible to fill. He believed that the human psyche is a totality, an intricate network of conscious and unconscious aspects. When someone falls into addiction, it is often not a conscious choice, but an attempt to seek relief, however temporary. If you identify with what we're discussing, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more content on how to understand and overcome the emotional and psychological challenges we all face. Together, we can explore healthier ways of dealing with life's adversities. Why do some people seem to plunge into endless addictions, while others manage to steer clear of these temptations? What really lies behind this overwhelming need to seek relief, even though we know it brings more pain than pleasure? Are we just dealing with destructive behavior, or is there a deeper search for something we don't know how to name? The truth is that addictions are often manifestations of an inner emptiness. This emptiness can be caused by a lack of meaning in life, emotional disconnection with others, or aspects of the personality that have not been recognized or accepted. Jung believed that, in order to deal with this emptiness, people often seek out behaviors that offer a temporary sense of relief. Addiction then becomes a form of escape, a way of escaping from painful reality. But this relief is always fleeting, and the return to reality is inevitable. When this happens, the suffering is usually even greater, because the problem has not been solved, only postponed. This cycle creates a vicious pattern, where the addiction doesn't cure the pain, but perpetuates it, making it increasingly difficult to escape. Gabor Maté, in his book The Kingdom of Hungry Ghosts, describes how false needs, no matter how many times they are satisfied, never leave a person truly satisfied. The human brain cannot feel that it has had enough, that it can relax and get on with other essential issues in life. Maté makes an analogy. It's as if, after a full meal, you're still hungry and have to go out of your way to get more food. This reflects the insatiable nature of addiction, which never fills the real void that the person is trying to heal. Maté also defines addiction as any repeated behavior, whether substance-related or not, in which the person feels an irrepressible compulsion, despite the negative impacts on their life and the lives of those around them. When thinking about addictions, we often focus on substances, such as drugs or alcohol. However, behavioral addictions are also extremely common and can be just as devastating. Activities such as compulsive use of social networks, pornography, video games, gambling, excessive shopping, or even excessive physical exercise or work can become addictions destroying the individual's life in the same way as any substance. As Gabor Maté explains, any passion can turn into an addiction. But how do you distinguish between the two? The line between passion and addiction is thin, and the central difference lies in control. Who is in charge? The individual or their behavior? Passion is something we can control, something that can be pleasurable and eventually healthy. But a passion that becomes obsessive, a need that we can't control, is an addiction. Addiction takes over. It dominates the life of the person who experiences it. The central question we must ask ourselves is simple but powerful. Given the damage you are doing to yourself and others, would you be willing to stop? If the answer is no, then you have already fallen into addiction. And if you can't keep your promise to stop, if you feel unable to give up the behavior that consumes you, then addiction has set in. Addiction is not a conscious choice. It is an invisible prison that seems impossible to break. What causes an addiction? There is a long debate about this. Some argue that addiction is a problem intrinsic to the individual, a weakness of character, or a moral failing. However, a more accurate explanation is that addiction is the result of the interaction between the subject and the object. Addiction manifests itself when a person regularly craves a change in their subjective state, i.e., they seek emotional or psychological relief that can only be generated by an object or activity. This behavior becomes compulsive as the person becomes dependent on this subjective experience. But what makes some objects or behaviors more addictive than others? As Natasha Shu explains in her book Addiction by Design, some objects or substances have pharmacological or structural characteristics that make them more likely to trigger or accelerate an addiction. Their potency lies in their ability to generate a subjective change, a feeling of pleasure or relief that certain people end up becoming dependent on. In fact, we are constantly surrounded by objects and activities with this potential, but what differentiates is the individual's vulnerability. In this video, we'll explore how susceptibility to addiction varies from person to person and what makes some more vulnerable than others. Gabor Maté has dedicated his career to working with addicts, and as he argues, all addiction, whether severe or mild, substance-related or behavioral, is, in essence, an attempt to find relief from emotional pain and suffering. Addiction is not a search for pleasure, it is a search for relief. Chronic use of substances or behaviors is often a way of escaping deep pain, a pain that can be visible or hidden in the unconscious. The forms of pain that drive someone to addiction are diverse. Some turn to addiction to self-medicate problems such as depression, insecurities, or anxiety disorders. Others to cope with the pressure of a stressful job or complicated relationships. And there are those who seek addiction as a way of avoiding the suffering caused by a lack of purpose or the hopelessness that comes with facing existential emptiness. Gabor Maté shares an impactful story of a 47-year-old man who had been addicted to drugs since he was a teenager. When asked why he continued to use drugs, he replied, "I don't know. I'm just trying to fill an emptiness in my life. It's boredom, a lack of direction." This void often has roots in the past, particularly in childhood. Studies indicate that the majority of hard drug addicts grew up in abusive or dysfunctional homes. Childhood trauma, as Gabor Maté explains, has a profound impact on a person's brain development. The dopamine system, the impulse control mechanisms, the limbic brain responsible for emotions, and the stress systems. All these brain systems can be sabotaged by traumatic childhood experiences. But it's not just physical trauma or abuse that makes a person more susceptible to addiction. What Maté calls parental emotional absence also plays a crucial role. Children who grow up with emotionally distant or cold caregivers are much more likely to develop addictions in adulthood. Psychologist Alan Shore described this as close separation, a situation where the parent is physically present but emotionally absent. This creates emotional distress which, if left untreated, leads to inadequate coping mechanisms, such as the development of addictions. When the parent is unresponsive or emotionally unavailable, the child creates forms of self-soothing, which can range from repetitive behaviors to emotional isolation. As Maté notes, this kind of emotional absence can considerably increase the risk of addiction in adulthood. But, as he also explains in The Kingdom of Hungry Ghosts, the lack of an adequate emotional presence from parents can affect a person's ability to connect with others and deal with emotions. And the impact of this can be seen not only in individuals with childhood trauma, but also in society in general. Today, many people, even those who had an apparently healthy childhood, turn to addictions as a form of self-medication against hopelessness. In a world increasingly full of uncertainty and a bleak vision of the future, many seek relief in the same traps as yesterday's addicts. We live in a society that demands conformity to standards that feed a vicious cycle of consumption and escapism. The need to adopt consumerism as a way of life and compulsively use technology, social networks, and entertainment is not only a cultural phenomenon, but also a response to the feeling of powerlessness and emptiness. The social storm created by this dynamic contributes directly to a crisis of addiction on a global scale. Gabor Maté writes that a deficient sense of emptiness pervades our entire culture. The addict is often more aware of this emptiness than most of us. Why are we so obsessed with acquisition and image? What drives us to this incessant search for something outside ourselves to fill the emptiness inside? Are we sinking deeper and deeper into an endless hole? Our consumerist culture, which values material and ephemeral things, only deepens this hole, leaving us emptier than before. This incessant quest for consumption, perfect images and status not only alienates people from themselves, but also prevents them from finding real solutions to the emptiness within. In addition, the growing number of people growing up in abusive or emotionally absent homes and the chaotic state of society make addiction an understandable way of coping with life. Although this search for relief is flawed and temporary, addictions do work for a while. They relieve suffering, emotional pain, and can even give a momentary sense of pleasure or meaning. But why do addictions work? Gabor Maté quotes the testimony of a drug addict who said, "I use drugs so I don't feel the feelings I feel when I'm not using." Addictions have the power to relieve emotional suffering and also to give the individual a momentary feeling of pleasure as an escape from the monotony and misery of everyday life. The psychologist William James, at the beginning of the 20th century, described the effect of alcohol as something that not only relieves tension, but also induces an experience akin to spirituality. In his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, he writes that drunkenness expands, unites, and says yes, unlike sobriety, which says no. James reveals the power of alcohol to stimulate the mystical faculties of human nature, functioning as a great exciter of the yes function in man. A point where we experience something that, for a brief moment, seems excellent and revelatory. However, this sensation is fleeting, and the addiction becomes increasingly destructive as the person seeks more of this experience until addiction takes over their life. The more we persist with an addiction, the more it becomes central to our lives. Tolerance develops, which means we need more of the substance or activity to experience any sense of pleasure. Gradually, everything that once brought lasting satisfaction, health, relationships, creativity, career, and life purpose begins to disappear, while the addiction becomes the sole focus. Addiction alters the structure of the brain, affecting the capacity for voluntary control. And this is where the phenomenon of brain block arises. The individual realizes that they are destroying their mind and body, but feels powerless to change. The essential question is, what is the possibility of overcoming an addiction? When we try to live an addiction-free life, the problem is that the same brain mechanism that needs to be healed is the one damaged by addiction. As Gabor Maté warns us, the more intense the addiction, the greater the biological obstacles to recovery. But the good news is that our brains are incredibly resilient. Even in old age, it is possible to restructure the brain in ways that allow us to live a full, healthy, and ultimately addiction-free life. This process of transformation, which Maté calls nodal awareness, is crucial for overcoming addiction. By becoming aware of the impact that addiction has on life, the individual takes the first step towards healing. Recognizing the addiction and the reasons that fuel it is the first step, but many people remain trapped in a vicious cycle of denial without ever questioning themselves deeply. To overcome addiction, it is necessary to confront the underlying suffering, the emotional pain it seeks to alleviate, and find a path to healing that no longer involves the temporary and destructive solutions that addiction offers. Now that you have a deeper insight into how addiction manifests itself and what it represents, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Share this video with anyone you think also needs to hear this message. Let's together create a space of support and understanding for everyone who is seeking a path of healing and transformation.